Hello everybody, it's Mr. Patak here. So this is a presentation I've made up for the beginning of the year talking about what is Latin. It's going to explore mostly the history of spoken and written Latin. In this video, I'm just going to read off what I've written. I'm going to try not to go off on any tangents or digressions because this video is going to be long enough as it is. Just know that because the history of Latin is so long and complicated, that some things in this presentation are simplified in terms of detail, and much more can be said about everything I'm about to share with you now. So, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. This presentation is called What is Latin? The History and Importance of Spoken and Written Latin. So why do we need to know about the history of Latin? I believe that if you want to know why we are studying something, it is important to know what the thing you are studying is. Lots of people today don't know the whole story of Latin. If people know about Latin, they usually know it as that really old and hard language. The study of Latin is over 2,000 years long. It was spoken and written by many people in diverse places and diverse times. The history of Latin is therefore very long and complicated. Hopefully by the end of this PowerPoint you will have a better idea of what Latin is, and then you can start to get a better idea of why we study it. Both parents and students should use this presentation, because as parents, you're sending your child to study Latin, and as a student, obviously, you're studying Latin, so it would be useful for both parties to know what they are studying and why. I'm going to skip this slide. This is basically saying the reason why I'm making this video instead of just giving you guys the PowerPoint. It's because the PowerPoint rather, is animated quite thoroughly, so you have to actually play the PowerPoint or watch this video. You can't just watch the PowerPoint through like Google Slides. It will look really messy, and I promise you it's not supposed to be that way. So here are some questions to answer. You don't have to necessarily answer these for like classwork for a grade, but what I mean is by the end of this presentation, I want you to be able to answer these questions. You should be able to answer these questions just from the information that was given. So feel free to take notes about what the questions are and answer them on a piece of paper. Question 1. Who spoke Latin? 2. When was Latin spoken? 3. What are languages always doing? 4. What do we call the languages that Latin changed into? 5. Is English a Romance language? 6. What are the main ways Latin has affected English? 7. What percentage of English vocabulary comes from Latin? 8. What do we call words that come from Latin? 9. Do written Latin and spoken Latin have the same history? 10. What happened to written Latin that made it so special and important? This is the first question. Who spoke Latin and when? Latin is a language that was spoken by the Romans around 2,000 years ago. That is, around the year 1. The Romans, conveniently, come from the city of Rome. The city of Rome is in the center of Italy, which is about right where this guy is pointing. This is the Roman Empire. So eventually, the Romans went from controlling that little dot there that this guy is pointing at to controlling all of the red stuff. They took it over, they conquered it, and it became the Roman Empire. Whenever the Romans took over more land, they usually brought Latin, their language, with them. And so the people in these countries started to speak Latin. Eventually, people from outside the Roman Empire, called barbarians, conquered it. The Roman Empire had fallen and was divided into lots of smaller kingdoms. But what happened to Latin? How did this conquest affect Latin? Before we answer that question, you need to know a little more about how languages change over a long period of time. So, very important thing about languages is that spoken languages are always changing, including Latin and English. We don't exactly speak English the same way as George Washington did, because he lived about 300 years ago. George Washington did not speak English the same way that Shakespeare did, because Shakespeare lived about 200 years before George Washington. Shakespeare did not speak English the same way that Chaucer did, because Chaucer lived about 200 years before Shakespeare. So let's look at something each of these three people from different time periods said. And you'll notice how the further back in time you go, the weirder the English looks. So here we have Chaucer, who lived in the years 1343 to 1400. This is about 600 years ago. Here we have Shakespeare, who lived in the years 1564 to 1616, or about 400 years ago, and George Washington, 1732 to 1799, or about 200 years ago. And I've given a quote of something each of these three people said. And because Latin is always changing, because languages are always changing, you'll notice that the further back in time you go from modern people, which is the year 2020, the further back in time you go, the things that they're saying sound less and less like the English that we speak today. That's because languages are always changing, and over time, there's a lot of change. So I'm going to try, I guess, to read each of these three quotes. The oldest one is, actually, let's go the other direction. Let's start with the most recent one, George Washington, something he said, and then go back in time and see how the language gets weirder and weirder as we go back in time. So George Washington, here's a quote that he said. "A primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, what species of knowledge can be equally important?" Now, 200 years ago, 200 years before George Washington was William Shakespeare. And here's something he said. "This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow, as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man." And then even 200 years before Chaucer, or 200 years before William Shakespeare, was Chaucer. And here's a quote, something he wrote. "When that the knight had thus his tale y told, in all the roots nas their young ni old, that he me said, it was a noble story, and worthy for to drawn to memory, and namely the gentles Verichon." So again, you'll notice how George Washington's English sounds kind of close to our English. Shakespeare's is, pretty weird, but you can probably understand it if you work hard enough. And then Chaucer's is even weirder still. And just for fun, I didn't put a quote that any modern people said, but here's something modern people would say. "Ate spaghetti while wearing a white shirt. Didn't get sauce on it." Now, obviously, modern people communicate mostly through selfies and memes, so our quotes are going to look a little bit different like that. But anyway, you see, as the further back in time you go, the more different the language becomes. And that happens for all languages, all spoken languages. So again, you can see how the English language has changed a lot over the last 600 years. If this change goes on long enough, won't there be a point when you cannot call English the same language anymore? This is the same exact thing. This same exact thing is what happened to Latin. So Latin was always changing too. When the barbarians destroyed the Roman Empire, each country began to develop more on its own. So you can see here how the Roman Empire was replaced by all these much, much smaller kingdoms, which are all like independent from each other. And this happened by around the year 500 AD. So over hundreds of years, the Latin that people spoke changed and became different languages in different places. Remember how English changed like I show you? Well, now each of these countries is sort of developing a little bit more independently, and so their languages will change from each other more independently. So the Latin becomes what we call the modern day Romance languages. They're named for the Romans. So over here in this little part of the world, Latin became Portuguese. Over here it became Spanish. Over here Catalan. Over here French, Italian, Romanian. And there's a bunch of much, much smaller ones. Like there's Eastern Romance languages, which are mostly extinct or endangered. There's, maybe a few 100,000 people who speak them, and they're just very small languages. There was a language called North African Romance, which has gone extinct. That means nobody speaks it anymore, obviously. And in fact, there's not much written, if anything, about North African Romance because it was conquered by the Arabs in about the 600s, and it replaced the Romance language completely. There's Sardinian language, which, pop quiz, if you want to know which of these is closest to Latin, most people would say it's Sardinian. And then there's Sicilian, and then there's a bunch of others, much smaller ones, which I didn't mention. I think there's one in southern France called like Occitan, and one like in this part of the world called like Dalmatian, something like that. So there's a ton of them. But the main ones that you'll recognize are Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, and Romanian. Those are the biggest. And of course called the Romance languages. So, is English a Romance language? There are two correct answers to this question, a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is no. English is considered a Germanic language, in the same family as German, Dutch, Swedish, and a few other languages. But the long answer is, in some ways, kind of. Latin has a really, really, really big impact on English vocabulary. So much that about 50% of English words are descended from Latin words, not Germanic words. So as this chart over here says, more than 50% of English vocabulary comes from Latin. But Mr. Patak, it says 29% right there. But remember that French is a Romance language too. So most of these words, pretty much all of them, are coming from Latin as well, which makes up more than 50% of the English language. And you see that only 26% is the core Germanic language. So now we need to look a little bit at the history of English too. So this is England, located in Britannia. It was also once a part of the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire fell, England was conquered by barbarians like everywhere else. The people who conquered Britannia after the Romans were known as the Angles and the Saxons, later called just the Anglo-Saxons. Now, unlike in most other places in the Roman Empire, the Angles language, called English appropriately, mostly replaced Latin. That is, there wasn't a Romance language that developed here at first. In France there was French, in Italy there was Italian, and those come from Latin. But the Latin that was spoken here actually got mostly replaced by English, by Old English. There are, of course, some Latin words that survived, and there was a little bit that got worked into English, but it was mostly replaced. But then, in the year 1066, this guy named William the Conqueror decided to conquer England. That's his name. That's what he does. He conquers places. Now, William the Conqueror is coming from down here, so he speaks French, an early form of French, at least. So William was from France, and so French and Old English got mixed together. This is one of the biggest ways Latin has affected English. So what are the main ways Latin has affected English? Well, as I've said already, some Latin words come into English from the time the Romans were in England. A lot of Latin words come into English through French, because English was conquered by a guy from France, William the Conqueror, in 1066. A lot of Latin words come into English through science. Whenever educated people needed a new word for something, they would look at Latin roots and use that to create their new word. We call words that come from Latin derivatives. For example, the Latin word pater means father. You might notice some English words that look a lot like pater. There's example paternal, patriarch, patriot, patronize, and more. You could say paternalistic, patriarchal, patriotic, patronizing, for example, so on. You can take these and expand them into lots of other little words. Now, it's not a mistake why they look like pater. So we can say, for example, paternal is a derivative of pater. Lots of Latin words have English derivatives. Remember, about 50% of English is made up of Latin words. Be careful not to confuse a derivative with the word's meaning. The Latin word pater means father, but paternal is a derivative of pater. So a lot of times the derivative will have a meaning kind of like the English meaning, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same. For example, paternal is like the adjective of father in English. So you can say that your father has a paternal love for you as his child. So that has to do with father, but it doesn't mean father. Same thing with all of these other ones. For example, patriarch. In olden times, the patriarch was the male head of the family. So he was like the father of the family. You called him the patriarch. And a patriot is someone who's willing to fight for the fatherland, the patria, and so on. Now, written Latin has a different history than spoken Latin. As we've already covered, spoken Latin developed into the modern-day Romance languages: Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, and many others. But written Latin actually became frozen and did not change much after about the year 100. This makes written Latin very special and unique, because all spoken languages are always changing. But written Latin got stuck in time and stopped changing. After the fall of the Roman Empire, all schools still taught the old style of Latin. No one wrote in Old Spanish, French, Italian for many years. Latin therefore became a way for people in different countries who spoke different languages to talk to each other. So the most important thing here is how Latin became frozen in time, kind of. And there's a lot of reasons why it became frozen in time, but that makes it, as I said, it makes it very, very unique, because you can imagine that someone, writing in the year 1 writes the same language as someone in the year 500 and someone in the year 1000 and someone in the year 1500. If it was a spoken language, it would have changed so much through that time. Even if it was a written and spoken language, like English is written and spoken, but it's still constantly changing. But what happened is the written Latin just became different from spoken Latin, and it became frozen in time. It became frozen at about the year 100. And then the spoken Latin just kept on developing on its own. Now, because Latin was taught in schools, it was the exclusive language taught in schools, pretty much every scientist, writer, philosopher, and so on would have used Latin until fairly recently. Like Dante was the first one to write a really famous work in what's called the vernacular, the native language. He wrote what's called the Inferno, and that was in like 1500, 1600. So like everything before that would have been Latin, and even after Dante, most people who were educated were still writing in Latin. So because written Latin became frozen in time, the written Latin that someone used in the year 1 is the same that someone writing in the year 500 or 1000 or even 2000 would write. The sameness here kind of creates a link to our past that is not possible by studying any other language. Only by studying Latin can you connect directly with someone writing today or 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. It's not possible with any other language, written or spoken, to do that, at least in the West. So written Latin began to be replaced by vernacular languages, which are languages that are spoken day to day by most people in the country, only around the 1700s and 1800s. So why study Latin today? Well, as you can see from everything that came before this, Latin has a very long and complicated history. So usually when people try to answer this question, they'll give you like ways you can use the language. Like, oh, it will help you better understand and appreciate the Romance languages because they all descend from Latin. Or they'll say like, oh, it will help you with your English because a lot of the time the very large, like very big and complicated words, like for example, patriarch, paternal, often are derived from Latin. And that's because the educated people were speaking or writing Latin because it's what you had to learn to go to school for thousands of years. Now, and also there's anything about learning any second language strengthens certain types of thinking, and especially with Latin because it's a very formal and organized language. Latin is what's called an inflected language, which means nouns, verbs, and adjectives sort of change endings to show meaning, which makes the structure of the sentences very loose. So there's a lot of thought that has to go into properly translating Latin, and so that strengthens certain types of thinking. Now, I also think that using Latin as a bridge to the past is one of the most compelling reasons to study it. No other language in the West has been used in the same form for so many years, which allows one who studies Latin to read and write the same language that people from so many diverse places and times with so many diverse beliefs and thoughts did. And that's going to be the end of this presentation. So hopefully by now you can answer all of the questions that I asked at the beginning of this presentation. If not, feel free to go back and watch certain parts of this again. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to seeing everybody in class again soon. As we say in Latin, valete, goodbye.